Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our seminar on product experimentation, the key to continuous innovation. My name is Amy Huang. I lead the digital products and platforms practice at the Institute of System Science, part of the National University of Singapore. This is my colleague, Scott C. At NUS ISS, our mission is to develop digital talent through education, applied research, consulting, and career services. Let's begin. So we are living in a very dynamic time for many reasons, but let's talk about technology today. Technology is advancing rapidly and constantly. Just in our lifetimes, we've seen drastic change in the way that we live, work, play, and communicate. I'm originally from the United States, and I've had a really fortunate career building digital products in the Silicon Valley since the early days of the internet. I've now been in Singapore for a few years, and it's really exciting to be here to experience the buzz of innovation in this region and to foresee the vast range of opportunities yet to come. As I've witnessed through my career, as fast as technology is changing and platforms are evolving, so are the processes we use to build those technologies and those platforms. Many of the principles have not changed, but over the years, we do continue to develop new skills and approaches to product development. One of the more significant recent evolutions is the shift from launching features to launching experiments so that we can iterate continuously toward innovative outcomes. Doing this well goes way beyond individual product managers, designers, developers, or even individual teams. Entire organizations are changing their mindsets to be more experimental in everything they do. So today, let's talk more about what it means and what it takes to have an experimental culture. All right, let's take a look at our agenda. To kick off the festivities, Scott will be giving us a short presentation about product experimentation, why it's important, how to approach it. Then we will follow with a panel discussion with some remarkable product leaders in Singapore. They represent diverse industries and technology sectors, and their range of perspectives will be really insightful. Throughout today's session, we'll be collecting questions at this QR code. The link will also be in the comments on Zoom. Please respond with your questions and vote up or down on the other questions so that we can make the most of this time together. Now I'm happy to hand over the mic to my colleague Scott C., Senior Lecturer and Consultant with the Digital Products and Platforms Practice at NUS ISS. Take it away, Scott.
Thank you. Thanks, Amy, for the introduction. So like what Amy mentioned, currently I teach at the Digital Products and Platforms Practice here at NUS ISS. I was in the industry quite recently, so my background was really in product management and strategy. Most of my career has been in tech startups and financial services. Another way I say that is that I spent most of my career in either 2-year-old companies or 200-year-old companies. So I hope to share perspectives from that unique vantage point with you guys today. Okay, so what I'm going to cover today are basically these 3 areas. 1, demystifying product experimentation. What do we mean when we say product experimentation? Then we look at the kinds of experiments that we can run, so more specific examples in this case. And then we step back and look at the big picture, looking at how do we foster this experimentation culture and mindset within the organization. So as product builders, a lot of you guys today, attendees here, are involved in some kind of product building or product organization, right? So as product builders, we have to juggle a lot of things. We have to look at user needs, technology, and also business value. But when we boil down the role, it all boils down to delivering value for clients and stakeholders, customers, citizens. It's all about delivering value for them. The key question, though, that we have to ask is, what is value? This is the big question, and this is where opinions start to differ. So, unfortunately, for many organizations, value is whatever management says has value, right? So this is a funny meme that I found on the internet, which I think encapsulates a product manager's life quite well. I experienced this quite a lot with my teams in the past. So what we did was we listed all the features, we scored each feature, so it can be this methodology like RIC, you can also use the MSCW, all these different methodologies. But at the end of the day, we throw away everything and then we just build what upper management tells us to build. So it's quite a mismatched process in that way, right? Another scenario, everyone in the company has a point of view on what to build, and they always say everything is a priority, everything is urgent. And as a product manager, you have a crowd of people rushing after you and telling them, like, you have to build my feature next, right? So that's another window into the life of a product manager. Or sometimes it can happen to us. We might have our own blind spots, thinking that we know better than the users. We know what's valuable for them, right? So when in fact there's a huge mismatch, we just want to get things out the door, but we hardly know what the users want. So the takeaway here is that assumptions can be misleading. We may think we know what's valuable when we actually don't. And that's a scary situation because our blind spots can lead to a lot of wasted effort and unhappy customers. And yet, this is how we usually build our products. Most product organizations, every time there's an idea, stakeholders come to us, and it's already in the form of a feature that we want to build. And we spend a lot of time building, developing 10 things, only to find out that only 3 of them worked. By work, I don't mean technical. Technically, it works, but nobody uses it. So there's a lot of wasted effort. How can we reduce this waste? So this is a different way of building products. We say that all ideas are hypotheses that we need to test. We validate them with experiments, we run them at a smaller scale, and we only build and deploy, let's say, the 3 experiments that worked, right? So this is a new sort of paradigm in terms of how we could build products, like what Amy mentioned. So this is not a comfortable shift. It's a big shift, but it may not be a comfortable shift. Management might look at you and say, and see you like this mad scientist when you mention the word experiment. What do you mean exactly by that? But what it really is we just want to treat each product change as a hypothesis that you can prove or disprove with experiments. What that helps us to do is to build the product, to build the right product, and also to build the product in the right way. And in this way, we can focus on outcomes rather than output. So it doesn't matter that we build a lot or a little, but what matters is that we move the needle in terms of the outcomes, the business and user outcomes that we want to drive. So if you notice the most successful companies, that's already how they operate. That's already what they're doing. The outcome-driven experimentation mindset. This is a quote from Satya Nadella, Microsoft CEO. And what he says is, instead of saying, I have an idea, what if you said, I have a new hypothesis, let's go test it, see if it's valid, ask how quickly we can validate it, and if it's not valid, then we move on to the next one. So this is very striking because even as one of the best CEOs of our time, he doesn't say, this is what I think works, and then he charges the team to say, let's do it, let's build it. Instead, he's open to being wrong and exploring what really works. Okay, so now we establish experimentation is good, it has benefits, but what exactly do we mean when we say product experiment? In the simplest terms, what we're doing is we're really pitting the current default state of the product or the control with a hypothetical state or what we call treatment, and then we pit them against each other. We see which ones are better in driving the business and user outcomes. So essentially, we have an A and we introduce a B and we see which one works better. So the key to all successful experiments is this North Star on the right, because this North Star can be a business outcome. For example, it can be about revenue, usage, retention, or it can be a user outcome for specific products. Like number of bookings, number of rides, let's say for a ride-hailing app, for example, or number of conversations for a messaging platform. But it needs to be clear and it needs to be tied to your strategic goal. Okay, so before we go and experiment, what we need to start with is a hypothesis. And it usually follows this simple format. We believe that by making certain X product change, that will lead to a positive result Y. And we are right if a meaningful outcome or the North Star metric moves by Z. And we can validate this easily by the type of experiment that we run. Okay, so it's a simple framework, but I think it would help for us if we illustrate that with a simple example. Okay, so this simple example, this is a very typical A/B test example on homepage conversions. Okay, so currently we have a register button that is color red, right? The one on the left that you see on the image. So we believe that by changing this register button to blue, that will lead to higher conversion rates. And we are right if conversion rates increase to 40% by the end of next month. We could then validate this easily by running the A/B test on the homepage. The crucial thing here to see is the third statement, to say the we are right if statement, because that sets the condition on whether your experiment passes or fails, whether you implement the new solution on the right or whether you keep the current solution on the left. So what we want to say as well is that is one kind of test, right? That is optimization. But we want to say as well that there's more to experimentation than just simple optimization tests. We can think of experimentation, of course, as a way of testing, is this the best way to build the solution, like what we saw in the homepage conversions? But in fact, we can use a similar experimentation mindset on potential business models, strategies, even marketing campaigns. So product experimentation is a spectrum, actually, that goes from optimization, but can also help with product discovery up the top of the stack, right? So it's not just about improving what we've already built, it can also guide us on deciding what to build. And at each of these levels, we make assumptions, right? So we were making assumptions about each of these questions. But as we move up higher up the stack, the riskier the assumption gets. So it helps to have this framework of testing the riskiest assumption first, to make sure that we get that out of the way, we validate that, and then we move downwards. And that also helps with prioritizing your experimentation. Of course, the way we do that is we have to tie that back to that North Star metric to see whether that actually moves the needle in terms of that North Star. Okay, let's try to make this more tangible and use this with more specific examples. Okay, so let's start with the less risky change first, the one at the bottom, which is about optimizing the solution. What you have to notice here is the top right corner, you have your North Star metric right here, which is driving up room bookings. So you're a booking service. That's ultimately what you want to achieve, right? So you then believe that if you look at this image, by displaying the checkout date when users select the age of their children. So if you notice, the one on the left doesn't display the checkout date. The one on the right says today's date, May 25, 2022, right? So that specific change, it's a small change, but we believe that that will lead to higher completion rates for the booking form. And we are right if the completion rates for the June bookings increase by 10% versus the monthly average. We then validate this easily by running the A/B test on the website. Okay, so it's one simple example. Companies like Booking.com, for example, run thousands of these tests simultaneously. So when I go to Booking.com, my version of the website may be different from what you see. And these changes may seem small, but at a large enough scale, even these small optimizations can probably cost millions of dollars for companies. So now we go up the stack. Now we go to the second question. Is this the right solution to solve the problem? Again, we keep that same North Star metric, driving up room bookings. But the question now is, so now we have a hypothesis. How do we drive up room bookings? And we use a new solution to think about how we can do that. So we believe that building a chat-based booking experience could lead to a better conversion than the web-based journey. We are right if the share of completed bookings is 15% higher than the website, and we can validate this easily by running a what we call a Wizard of Oz experiment. Now, let me zoom in a little bit on this Wizard of Oz experiment. And I want to reinforce here the principle of lowest cost way to test something. So Wizard of Oz essentially is a type of experiment where you have, we are thinking about building a chatbot here, right? But behind that is actually like a group of humans who are answering the questions. So what you're trying to do there is you're just testing the user feedback and response, but you're not building the back end yet. So that can help you solve and skip the development effort if you just want to see first whether or not what you're building is worthwhile, right? So this is one way to test it. If it meets the condition that the share of completed bookings is 15% higher than the website, then we can basically implement that and we can then build up the complete solution once we are able to validate with the Wizard of Oz experiment. Okay, so this is another example. Finally, we move up even higher on the spectrum towards product discovery. So the question now here becomes, are we solving the right problem? And in here, we have a huge hypothesis, a very risky hypothesis, which is we believe that offering a short-term rental booking service for overseas students will lead to increase in new customers from the student segment. So a lot can go wrong here, right? It's very risky because we are now expanding to a whole new segment. But is there a way we can test this risky assumption without having to bet the whole farm on it? Something simple that we can do in this case is maybe building a simple landing page that first tests the demand before we go further. So we can say we are right if signups, let's say, reach by more than 1,000 by a certain date, let's say end of August. And then we validate that by creating the new landing page to gauge the demand, right? So that sounds familiar to a lot of the product builders here in this room, right? Because that's essentially the concept of the MVP, the minimum viable product. But how we can frame this from an experimentation point of view is to say that the MVP, we can also call it the RAT. I just added the image here so that you can remember it more easily, the rat image. But what essentially it is it's what we call the riskiest assumption test. Okay, so what you do is when you build an MVP, you go through a cycle of build, measure, and learn. And then you go and test the next risk. Okay, so you go through that whole cycle, and then you try to test what is the most risky assumption that I can test, and that is essentially the concept of MVP. Okay, so in an ideal world, we want to test everything, right? We want to experiment on everything. But in reality, we live in a world of constrained and limited resources. So we need a framework to think about how we could prioritize the experiments. So for me, it was a helpful rule of thumb to think about these three questions. First, what is my riskiest assumption? Then, what is the impact if I am proven right? And then last, what is the least expensive way for me to test it? So by thinking about framing problems and then going through the litmus test of these questions, we will be able to help better prioritize the product experiments that we can run, which in turn will help us prioritize the features that we build. Okay, so if we were to summarize that, the goal of product experimentation, it's not necessarily to win, but to learn as fast as we can. Winning, of course, is a nice bonus, but sometimes it's the failures that lead us to the most important conclusions. it's hard. It's a big shift. Companies need to kiss a lot of frogs before they can find a prince. But in the end, what we do is we develop institutional memory that arise from the successes and failures of these experiments. And we become a learning organization through product experimentation. Okay? So organizations often see experiments as wasted effort. But the real wasted effort is the example that you see here above. Because you go a roundabout way, you have an idea, you immediately want to implement that as a feature, but it leads to a failed feature, another failed feature until you reach a successful feature before you hit the outcome. In this experimentation paradigm of building things, you start with an idea, you develop that into a hypothesis, then you test that with an experiment, which will increase your likelihood of getting to a successful feature, which then leads to an outcome that's meaningful for your business. So thinking about ultimately the benefit of experimentation is it leads to less waste and more value. So this is part 2 of the quote that I was sharing earlier from Satya. And it says, there's no harm in claiming failure if the hypothesis doesn't work. Being able to come up with a new way of doing things, how one achieves success, is through a series of failures. It's a series essentially of hypothesis testing. So in experimental cultures, like what we see in those successful tech companies, employees are undaunted by the possibility of failure. And it helps to have this mindset shift start from the top. The best run in the companies understand that experiments are inherently gambles or bets that they have to take in order to become more innovative. So if you're going to have a risk-taking culture, it helps to frame failure as learning opportunities. Now, you may be asking and wondering, how does that apply to me, right? If it's only tech companies that can do this, right? Well, actually, no. It varies a lot between organizations. So we have 3 different types of organizations here, right? So let's say you have a startup, or you're part of a startup, or even it could be a new venture within a larger firm. And your concern will be, I want to move fast and I want to find a market for my product. If you're a large corporate, you're probably thinking, I want to be more innovative. I want to build new things. And yet too many complex processes stand in the way. And then in the case of tech companies, yes, they have more developed experimentation cultures, but they might say, I want to stay on the leading edge, and they might have a tendency to want to test everything. Okay? So given this is the background, what is the best course of action then? So in the case of startups, it's helpful to think of the entire business as an experiment. So you're still at that stage probably where you're trying to grapple with product market fit. So it helps to have product discovery experiments that help you get there faster. For large corporates, it can start with optimization experiments tied to metrics to prove business value. So I can give an example here. So in my old company, which was one of the big multinational banks, the way we were able to implement experimentation is to start small and zero in on a metric. We did not even start with a product or a landing page. We started with emails. So we just sent sales emails that have an A version and a B version, see which one works better, which has a higher click-through rates. Once we've proven success in that small example, then we move up and look at differentiating landing pages. So there's an A version and a B version of a landing page. And then we start building even more versions of that until we were able to prove that as well. And then we were able to move up and actually drive product changes. So we were now working at A and B for the app itself, A and B versions for the app itself. So that's a way for us to progressively move towards a more experimentation mindset and culture. When we start small, we prove them with small wins, and that's how we were able to expand. Finally, for tech companies probably already have all the tools. You collect a lot of data, but that's why it's helpful to keep the big picture in mind, because you don't want to get lost in the weeds just because you have all the data and all the tools, and you end up using data as a crutch. You want to prioritize your riskiest assumptions. That's the key, right? You still have to prioritize. So, all in all, what I want to say here is that there's no such thing as a one size fits all when it comes to experimentation. It varies between different organizations, different cultures, and that's essential. But what's important to understand here is that every type of company actually has the capability to start with experimentation. So with that, we will hear more from our panel about how to foster a culture of experimentation. Our panel comes from a diverse set of backgrounds. So I think we can have a healthy mix of insights that we can gain out of them. Okay, so that ends my short presentation on experimentation. If you have questions, actually you can scan this QR code or go to the link for you to submit your questions. And now we proceed to the panel discussion.
Great. All right, thank you so much, Scott, for that overview of why and how to think about product experimentation. I really appreciated the way you set examples with the same North Star to show that there are many different ways to run an experiment and different contexts, right? I also can completely relate to those comics at the beginning. I think I've worked with every single one of those characters for sure. Okay. So as Scott mentioned, this is a great time for you to start entering your questions. I see a couple questions coming in already, and I will start off the conversation with some of my own questions, and then we'll give the list of questions a chance to populate and vote so that we can, I guess, best run this discussion. So now I am thrilled to bring up our panel of product leaders. I guess we can, are we up on screen? Okay, so collectively, this group of product leaders has really had wonderful and varied careers. They cover a range of industries, company types, and markets. I've personally had the pleasure to work with each of them in different ways, and I'm really excited to bring them together to share their perspectives as a group. So let me start with Dominic Chan. Dominic is the director of the National Digital Identity at GovTech and a champion for product management across the Singapore government. At ISS, we collaborate on the Digital Academy to offer product management education for the public sector. Dominic, can you please share a few words about yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the nice introduction. Yeah, so I have been doing product management in the digital space for the last 3 to 4 years. But before that, I actually came from the private sector and I was doing the same for more towards the hardware space. So I'm looking forward to a discussion and yeah, thank you very much.
Great. Welcome, Dominic. Thanks for your time. Next up, we have Sylvia Tom. Sylvia has an extensive background leading product platforms in Southeast Asia and beyond. Most recently, she was the CTO at Zalora. Sylvia is also very active in the product management community in Southeast Asia. It's actually where I've met her years ago. There are just a really wonderful community, or many communities in Southeast Asia, of product people just sharing experiences, having events, and just sharing wisdom. Sylvia is also one of our adjunct lecturers at NUS ISS. Welcome, Sylvia.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. Yeah, sharing also maybe a few additional words about myself. So I've been practicing digital product management for the past 12 years. I started out mostly in the consumer space, so building B2C products. But especially during my time at Zalora, I had the chance to also build quite a range and suite of B2B products. So like both worlds. And at the moment, I'm consulting a lot of startups, so I can very much relate to what Scott was presenting earlier when you're in that very early stage of still validating a whole business in itself. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Sylvia. All right, and now we have Gaurav Tandon, Head of Consumer Product at Grab. I had the pleasure of working with Gaurav at Redmart and Lazada. We agonized over taking the complexity of the supermarket logistics process and making it as seamless as possible for the customers. Hi, Gaurav. You want to add a few words about yourself, please?
Hey, thanks, Amy. Yeah, really great to be here, and looking forward to the discussion. There are a lot of these things that I think Scott was talking about, like very relatable. We often see that kind of dichotomy in the teams where sort of like they're trying to like launch something, but there's a pressure to like launch, and there's a need for experimentation. So I have to like share some of these thoughts, at least from my own experience in the past.
Great. Okay. And Scott, also please chime in during this discussion.
Yep.
I see some questions coming in from your presentation, and so we'll probably address them over the course of the discussion as well.
Sounds good.
Great. Let's get going. So, as Scott shared, experimentation can be quite a significant mindset shift, and there are quite a few different ways to approach product experimentation. So, I would love to hear from this panel on specific examples to start on how you have applied experimentation to drive a specific product success and business outcome. So maybe we'll go around the room and you can just tell us about the problem, how you framed the experiment, what you learned, and the impact. Dominic, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure, Amy. Yeah, there are a few products that came to mind. Maybe perhaps I can share a little bit of background of one where most Singaporeans will be familiar with. So I was responsible for managing and launching the product of the Trace Together token. So in the not so distant past, when we were all grappling with COVID, we were handed with a problem. And the problem statement was that we had to help the digitally excluded participate in the Trace Together program. So we had to produce the hardware that actually emulate what the Trace Together app does, right? And because we were hard up for time, we had to get it right at the same time. So there was a series of experiment that we started even from at the board level, right? The printer circuit board level. We were doing various level of experiments, testing first, the technical feasibility. And as we actually launched, a lot of people will be familiar that there were many shapes and sizes that we had produced. The story behind that is that actually each of them was introduced to solve a problem, right? We had the one that looks more like an airport. That was a very original version. Then we had to solve a problem of battery life. And then we had to deal with a series of experimentation, both in terms of not just the technical part of things, but also how user actually carry them and how much power you can pack inside a product. Then we launched a second version that looks like a wedge. And I had, despite various experiments with various users, right? I had this old lady that came to me and told me that, your token actually gives me a heartache. And I didn't quite understand it initially when we tested on the ground. And then she explained to me that because she hung it around the neck and it was very heavy, it keeps hitting on the chest. And very quickly we had to move on and pivot, right? So we actually went on to a third version where it was a bit smaller. So the reason behind why there were so many versions was simply because of various levels of experimentation that we were doing in the background. But because we had to sprint very quickly, we couldn't wait until we get the best product before we actually launch it, right? So, but what is pervasively being used now is that very nice oval shaped looking one that most people actually carry. But the story behind it was that went through a series of experimentation. We tested it. Despite testing, we learn new things even and we do a small launch, and then we continue to iterate it as we go along, right? So I think that is a very relatable experience of why experimentation is very important. Otherwise, we couldn't have launched the product in a matter of like 14 weeks from drawing to delivery. Yeah.
Great example. Yes, and thank you for that, because those of us in this room, we've definitely lived it. So I definitely appreciate the amount of care that went into that process. Who wants to go next? Sylvia, how about you?
Yeah, I can share a bit about some of the A/B tests that we did at Zalora. And I think also very similar to the situations in one of Scott's memes is that you sit in a meeting and the head of another department comes up with a question like, oh, could we change this button color to blue? Or, can we move this icon around to, another area? And of course the answer is yes, we can do that. The question is like, does it really make sense? Or rather, what are going to be what kind of effect will it have? Will it really improve the user experience? So in my experience, I think within a whole organization, there can be many, many ideas, and people are typically like very, very convinced that their idea is something that the customer actually wants. So how we tackled those situations was, if it was possible, we set it up as an A/B experiment. And we let it run over the course of a couple of days, or sometimes we even needed a couple of weeks just to get a critical mass and a significant result, and then presented back like, what did we see? How did consumer behavior change? Did it improve the conversion rate? Did it improve really the engagement with that particular area where we did the change? And sometimes there were very well, not to maybe my surprise, but to the surprise of the person who had the idea, the results were totally different. And a lot of times, actually, it didn't make a big difference or a positive impact. But it's so powerful to prove that with as little effort as possible. So we picked experiments that are easy to execute and to really show the numbers, and the numbers speak for themselves. Whether it's really improving the business or rather improving the customer experience.
Great. Thanks, Sylvia. How about you, Gaurav? Do you have any examples for us?
Yeah, I think I'll maybe share an example where we got sort of like thrown into the deep end of experimentation by more serendipitously than like basically in a planned manner. So this was we were launching a subscription product back in India, and like we basically planned that we will sell like 10,000 subscriptions in like 1 month, right? And I think like remember 8 hours into the launch, we had already sold 10,000, and we had to like shut down sales. And this was important because subscription was structured in a way that the restaurants were going to give discounts to the subscribers, right? So you can't overwhelm the restaurants with too many subscribers, right? Because then that's like it started impacting their economics. So there was a delicate balance to be maintained, right? So we thought, okay, like 10,000, like good start for like month one, and that's where we start, right? And when we basically like, so it's not a good situation when you have to like go to your team on day one and say that, okay, like you need to shut down sales, right? And once we shut it down, we realized that actually the potential was a lot more, but we did not know what we had to do to get to that potential, right? So basically, we literally our entire product roadmap went out of the door, and we basically had to say that now we have to like really figure out what the right acquisition strategy for users is, right? How do we basically get users in a manner that sort of doesn't overwhelm the restaurants, and you sort of like keep maintaining that demand supply balance, right? So so we got into this kind of experimentation mindset where we had to figure out the right acquisition model. We moved from that to like a flash sale model, and from like a flash sale model to a referral model, and from a referral model to like to another model. And we were basically trying to figure out what really gets users into that funnel in the right way, and what drives sort of like a better acquisition or a more sustainable acquisition strategy, right? And then there were like micro experiments within that. Like, so for example, the first time we wanted to do flash sale after we shut down sale. We did not know, are there enough users who will like create that kind of like environment for a flash sale? So we actually went to a very similar approach that Scott talked about, where we actually created a sign up as a precursor to the flash sale. Is that okay? Like if we get enough signups, we know that like there will be a good enough flash sale. But as sort of like over a period of time, as we started seeing the signups started weaning away, we knew that, okay, like flash sales are not going to be like the right model, so we need to move to a different model, right? So there was a constant iteration on the program, and now the program is like at millions of subscribers globally. But when we started off like that those were the beginnings. Like we literally thought that we'd sell like 10,000 in a month, and sort of the entire thing had to change to a very experimentation kind of mindset, because the roadmap that we planned for didn't apply anymore. And so yeah, that's just like one of the examples I remember quite fondly.
Great. You know what I really appreciate about all three of your examples is how different they were and how well they cover the scope of types of experiments that Scott explained. So Sylvia, your examples were much more about very specific requests from specific stakeholders to prove the value of making a specific change. And Dominic, your example was much more like, we know what the problem is. We don't yet have a solution for it. So let's try a bunch of different solutions. And then Gaurav, your problem was much bigger. Like, I think it spanned across a lot of different possible problems. But this idea that you have even the target you're setting or the North Star you're setting, you might need to experiment on as well. So that's really interesting. How about, okay, so let's talk about experiments, right? We all go into an experiment with a hypothesis, and that implies that we know what's going to happen. And I know Gaurav, your example kind of already highlighted this or previewed this, but what happens when it doesn't go the way you planned? Can you all give us examples of how you approach experimentation gone awry, or maybe just experimentation gone like unexpectedly? Gaurav, why don't you go first? You can either tell us more about that example or a different one.
Yeah, so I think it's an important sort of like point in terms of the experimentation mindset, right? Like an experiment by definition has a chance of failure, right? And therefore we need to like accept that going into the experiment, right? So I won't really qualify them as like unexpected results. I think like we should embrace the failures that come with experiments. We should just like try to get to those failures in the fastest and the cheapest way, so that we can learn and move forward from that, right? So I think one of the examples that comes to mind is in one of my previous roles at Carousel, we were trying to launch a new category in terms of like how we get users to buy secondhand items with more confidence on the platform. And we created sort of like a sort of a value proposition around it, saying that, okay, let's start in the electronics category where the pain point is probably the highest. And let's try to figure out like what exactly do users want over there, right? What will really get users to like buy secondhand phones as compared to like buying first-hand phones? And we had a few hypotheses around like whether it's about warranty, whether it's about like the fact that the phone is certified, checked, and all these kind of things. And one hypothesis within that was that if we create a good enough experience for users, users don't need to chat, right? And I think like if you've been on Carousel, you'll notice that chat is like an important part of like that product overall. And what we realized is, so we actually said that, okay, we don't know why users chat. Like, I mean, we know like broadly hypothesis that users want like to ask some questions, users want to negotiate. And what we realized is that we moved from a private chat. We said that, okay, let's create, because we don't know, we can't like go into people's chats and figure out what they're asking because that's all private. So let's move to a public FAQ or a public Q&A, right? And where basically buyers will be able to ask questions publicly, sellers will be able to answer questions publicly. So then we know what users are asking for, right? And what we realized is that we got really good insights from like moving to this like private to public kind of question framework. And we understood that people are asking about whether they can get, like a trade in, whether they can get like some sort of a installment plan or something like that. But we realized that only 3% of the users were actually like doing any public Q&A, right? And that really got us thinking like our chat percentage used to be much higher. Like, why aren't people like asking public Q&A? And we realized that, and you couldn't get that like answers from the experiment. The experiment like by itself sort of like meant that there was a massive drop in the funnel conversion because of moving from chat to public Q&A, right? And then we went back to users and started asking them for feedback, and we realized that there are questions that users are not comfortable asking in public, right? People want to negotiate, but like you don't want to like be negotiating publicly, right? So even if I want like basically $10 off or $20 off on that phone, I won't ask that question publicly, right? And I think like that's where we realize that there are these kind of like psychological things that we have to also cater for. And eventually say that it's rather than now that we've understood what people are asking, maybe give a way for people to highlight in their private chat or like give a feedback to us that here are the things that I really would like in the product, rather than trying to like get users to choose between private or public Q&A, right? And I think then we migrated back to allowing users to do chat privately so that then they could ask all these questions, and then we saw the conversion rate started picking up again, right? So at least like that was an assumption that we made, that like people will be okay asking questions publicly, and what we realized is that there are maybe like cultural things or psychological things because people don't do that, right? So that was like an interesting blind spot that we didn't anticipate, and we learned from that experiment.
Great. That's interesting, because I think what you've highlighted there is that every experiment can actually lead to new hypotheses that then need more experimentation. It is a little bit of a virtuous cycle in that way. Okay, great. Sylvia, do you have any examples of experiments that yielded unexpected results?
Yeah, so continuing with the example of, we were changing some parts of the shopping experience, and we're testing them through A/B tests. So Zalora is in 6 different consumer markets across Southeast Asia. So the way we were running those tests was actually on a country by country base. And so what was interesting in this type of experimentation is that you do get different results for different countries. So then what do you do? Because it was one platform, it was one code base. And the way we and it happened very, very frequently, actually, that, you had absolutely no change or no indication of a positive change for 2 countries, but the other 4 markets were showing positive signs. Usually how we handled it was that we would apply a sort of feature flag. So we implemented the change for those countries where there was a positive result. And we dropped the idea for those countries where there wasn't any positive result, or sometimes even, negative signs in terms of like conversion rate dropped or the engagement, click-through rate dropped or whatever. And then exactly what you just said, we thought again about those countries where it didn't work. And typically it's something that was rooted in the consumer behavior. And also, the e-commerce landscape in those different markets is very different. So competitors are very different. And maybe we were experimenting with a feature that was already very well known in Singapore, and everybody, was embracing it and adopting it very quickly. But Indonesia took a much longer time, because there, how people experienced going through the shopping funnel, they had learned different things, and there were different practices and UI elements in place from other shopping sites, and that definitely then of course influenced our audience as well. And so we had to go back to the drawing table and figure out, like, okay, why this result is there? Let's look at how competitors are dealing with it, and then start a totally new sequence of experiments for those 2 countries in my example that didn't show any positive traction. But it can get complex actually quite quickly, because you're juggling and managing these different markets, and you have to have some sort of a strategy. If you have one code base for different markets, you have to have a strategy how you handle that with feature flags, and suddenly it can get into a whole like tree of different experiments, and your user interfaces are developing in different directions. Yeah, but that's a bit from the playbook also, in terms of how do you deal with localization in different markets and this whole experimentation setup.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. When we were at Lazada, we had very thorough testing procedures around, what we launch to which countries at what time. And of course, we always have this hope that the solution will be, one solution to solve everyone's problems, but usually it's a lot more complex than that. So, and certainly adds complexity to the planning of the experiments as well. Yeah. Okay, great. So Dominic, how about you? Do you have examples about unexpected results?
Yeah, there has been many of such experiments that bring about unexpected result. I can think of a few, but maybe I'll find one that is more recent and again, people will be familiar with. And then in this example, it was not a question of the unexpected result coming during the experimentation phase. But in the initial launch, we actually suddenly realized that we learn new things, right? So that was this launch of the digital IC in the SingPass app. We actually was having this hypothesis that people actually would love to not carry their wallet, and we try to incorporate whatever the government issue as much as possible to the app, all right, so that we can actually provide more value adding services to citizens. So we included the NRIC and we included driver's license and various types of documents that the government issue into the SingPass app, and we put it right smack in the homepage. When we went to do various user testing, we learned that actually people appreciate this, what we are trying to do, and a lot of users that we test tell us that, oh, this is great, and I really want to be able to flip this out very quickly and use it if I'm being asked to produce an IC. So you think about situations where you enter a building where you need to register, or even when you need to prove your age or prove your identity in various scenarios. And of course, with this various set of testing that confirm that people actually find this extremely useful, we decided to put this really up front and center so that it can be retrieved with as little click as possible, right? And then we went to experiment further to say, how do we actually bring that out as easily as possible? Now, guess what? When we actually launched this feature, then there was a fraction of people who felt that their privacy was being intruded, because they said that, oh, how come when I turn on the app, straight away, right smack in the center was my NRIC? And we have to very quickly observe and take in that feedback. And in a matter of 2 weeks or 3 weeks after we have launched that feature, we took in further feedback, and then we continue to pivot and modify such that people now have options to then hide that away, and we give users the choice to decide, right, for themselves if they really want to make it so easily accessible, or they want an additional click to call it out. So I guess the point I want to make here is that the experiment indeed, initially show certain positive results, but maybe on hindsight it was a little bit confirmation bias. We were asking not exactly the right questions, but we learn as we go along, and we identify new unexpected findings, right? And then we incorporate that insight, and then we try to continue to make the product as good as possible through multiple iterations.
That's really interesting. I love hearing your examples, Dominic, because I'm definitely your user. So I think that's really interesting. For those of us not in the public sector, the window into the public sector and how you do product development, I think is very fascinating. All right, so let's talk. Okay, so we've gotten some very concrete examples, and I think we've all heard from each of these stories that there's a lot to think about, right, in any one experimentation decision or process. And it helps me certainly to hear the specific examples, because it gives me a way to relate what, in my own context, my own products, what kinds of tests or experiments I might run. But maybe we can take a step up now and talk about the big picture. How do you think about having a larger culture of continuous experimentation? Because, of course, we start with one experiment, and that's always a great way to start. But ultimately, I personally find it's going to be more rewarding if we're doing multiple experiments or running experiments as a process or as a habit rather than one at a time. And of course, the more you do, the easier it gets, right? So that takes deliberate effort to bring a whole organization or even a whole team along for this experimentation journey. So maybe we can talk about some key principles for how you guide your team to be experimental or guide your organization to be more experimental. Gaurav, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I think there is usually first an overarching structure that I think like Scott touched upon in the presentation as well. Like I think like what I usually advise the teams to do is lay out that entire plan for what that experiment is going to look like and align all the stakeholders on that plan, right? So they need to be asking like why are they running the experiment? What is the hypothesis that they're trying to test? What is the North Star metric that they're going to be looking at? What are they going to measure success against, right? And anchor all the decisions in that, right? So the rest of the plan flows from that, answering that why, right? And that is really important for aligning all the stakeholders, right? And then basically the second part is essentially on aligning on um, what is the experiment going to run like, or how are you going to run the experiment? Like, are you going to sandbox it in terms of like a certain number of users? Are you going to look at a before and after kind of analysis? Are you going to run it as an A/B? Like, what exactly are you going to do, right? And how are you going to like how long you're going to run that experiment? Like, are you going to get? Are you going to? What is the time period that you would probably need to run it to get statistically significant results? Because otherwise, the results will like not be non-conclusive. So you need to define all of that, right? And then the third part is essentially like how you're going to actually operationalize that internally, right? And that is where I think like a lot of the operating model for running experiments and like how the teams work internally comes into play, right? So in a lot of cases, it requires like the engineering teams to work in a certain like cadence and have that kind of like rhythm that they can actually run faster experiment. Like this is something we noticed when we first tried to do this at Carousel earlier, like that we needed actually to, for that particular journey that I described earlier, we needed to actually move from fortnightly sprints to weekly sprints because we wanted to run like faster experiments, which also meant that the design and the product, the design and the product managers had to sort of like start getting all the requirements together like much earlier, right? So there has to be like this continuous rhythm, and it took us almost like a month to get into that rhythm because initially we were not used to some of those things, right? But then some of these things can be so those are like the three big building blocks, right? Now how you institutionalize this can depend from organization to organization. So for example, at Grab, we are moving to empowered teams where essentially like the teams have aligned with the stakeholders on what the bigger problem spaces are, which is aligned with the overall strategy, and that the teams have enough flexibility to run experiments internally within that, right, to try to validate different kinds of hypotheses. And these are like cross-functional teams across business, product, design, engineering, analytics. So there are like different ways that organizations approach institutionalizing this. Of course, like if you can create empowered teams, that's like a great start. It does require like more alignment at an organizational level. But even if that structure doesn't exist, there is a way to sort of like actually define this plan in the building blocks that I talked about, and at least like get it started for specific product launches or product work streams, right? So that's at least been my experience in how we can move towards a more experimental culture.
Okay, great, thanks. Sylvia or Dominic, do you have anything you want to add or counter?
Yeah, sure. I think those points are all very valid. That in my organization, experimentation is very widely accepted and embraced. I think we do that a lot in our Agile framework. For me personally, the other thing that I do advocate within my role actually is applying design thinking. Right, so we do apply that frame quite often as we guide, especially user-related products, to follow that in a more sequential and systematic way. But I can probably share a few things I observe very often in at least my organization, and some of the things I always keep having to remind my team members on, right? One is very close to what Gareth had mentioned, whereby we need to be very clear about what the hypothesis is and set the exit criteria at the beginning, right? Because what we always end up doing, or at least some of my guys end up doing, is that we always end up going down the rabbit hole where we don't have a very clear exit criteria. We don't know when is it that it's time to move on to confirm that yes or no, and make that decision, right? And what I also sometimes see in some of the teams that I work with is this inertial to proceed, where they are so worried about whether the hypothesis is right or wrong, and they keep designing various type of tests around it. What I personally, or rather at least a personal principle, is this, right? When the experiment gets too expensive or too resource intensive, then we have to always measure the trade-off, right? If it costs more to experiment than to build it, or the cost or the opportunity cost actually is too huge to wait, then actually we should take some measured risk, and go ahead and do some part of the development work, rather than to keep hiding behind experiments and keep pushing, say, oh no, we need to do another set of experiments, which will take another 4 weeks, 6 weeks. So I would say I always want to strike a balance and get the team to really be a bit more bold about it, and take a measured decision to balance between risk taking as well as experimentation.
Absolutely. Very, very good points. I think Sylvia made that point earlier too, is that making the resources, basically using your experimentation as a way to make the best use of your time, right? The best use of your resourcing. And that includes the decision to build something, but also let's include the time it takes and the effort it takes to run the experiments. Sylvia, do you have anything you want to add to high-level principles around being experimental?
No, I think actually, a lot of it that was covered is definitely, yeah, has been part of my experience as well. Maybe to shift a little bit to another topic, because I think what I was also hearing, and there are some questions around, like, how do you kickstart actually this culture of experimentation? I mean, we come from companies or organizations which are digitally native, but actually want to share a bit of an anecdote from Zalora as well in the early days, where we didn't have such a strong experimentation culture, to be honest. So one way how we started to plant the first seeds and introduce it was that we were, instead of going straight away to building a new feature, we were testing out some mock-ups with customers. We brought real customers into the Zalora office, and we were recording those sessions. And then when there were meetings in a bigger group, especially with other departments, because I think in the product team and in general in the engineering team, there was definitely an awareness and was fully understood that experimentation is very valuable. And it works. But how do you get in on board also other departments who maybe don't have the same mindset, or who are hearing about it for the very first time? So very powerful was sharing those interviews with them and really making them listen to what customers were saying. And it was a huge eye-opener, because especially a company like Zalora, where there is not a physical store, retail store where you meet customers, everyone is on their screen, and typically the other departments, apart from customer service, maybe they don't have a chance to meet customers. For them, this was like a big eye opener, and like almost like a shock, like, okay, finally I see a customer, I hear a customer. And there were so many insights there. This was definitely, a huge step forward, and made many people at least curious and asking for more insights. And then from there, step by step, we moved a lot. Couple of departments definitely moved a lot faster into this experimentation mindset, and were a lot more open to partner up with the product team.
Wonderful. And thank you for bringing us in that direction, Sylvia, because I think all three of you have brought up some mention of design thinking, user research, user interviews. And I think it's probably worth calling out, what is the relationship between user interviews, talking to actual customers and users, versus, more of this idea of launching something, even if it's lightweight or, Wizard of Oz, whatever it is. I think sometimes in an organization, different people are responsible for those different tasks, and they don't always coordinate in one whole. So can you talk a little bit more about how you decide when you do one, when you do the other, and how to relate them?
Maybe I'll start, or I'll just continue with this one and this example. So one basic guideline that helped me personally to, have this as a point of orientation, but also to sort of make it easy to understand for people who are new to A/B testing and user interviews, is that So in the A/B test, you just see like what's happening, but you don't see like why something is happening. And the why you find out by actually talking to customers. I think that's very simple, for people to understand, and can be a powerful comparison and sort of help as an orientation. Okay, when do we do A/B tests? When do we sit down with the customer? Yeah, so we use this like constantly as a guiding principle, especially when you have some heated discussions like, oh, we need to do this and we need to do that, and people are defining are starting to draw up like a huge to-do list, etc. Okay, let's go back to those basics, like in which situation are we actually right now, and which tool do we pick?
Great. Gaurav, Dominic, Scott, anything?
Yeah. Yeah, if I can like add to that, I completely agree. Like, I think one of the basic principles which Sylvia talked about is essentially like where if you're trying to like understand the why behind the user actions, right? And if I can just like build on top of that and anchor in some of what Scott and Dominic said earlier, right? So part of like when you think about user research versus like different kinds of like models like A/B testing is also anchored in what I think Scott showed as sort of like the spectrum of like of what some of these like tests can solve for, right? So for example, when you're trying to solve like mostly optimization problems, you will naturally anchor a lot more in like A/B tests that sort of like give you quick results, and you'll like try to move forward from that. But when you're sort of like talking about more discovery related problems, you have to go and understand why something is happening, right? And that's where there needs to be a good user feedback loop for you to be able to do some of these kind of things. And usually like some of times those loops don't exist. You have to sort of like try to do those offline, and then gradually you have to start building more and more on some of these kind of things. And then the other part, which I think like Dominic alluded to earlier, is the cost of doing some of these things, right? That if you're trying to answer some questions, and every time you have to like get, I don't know, like basically like 20, 30 users to like give you feedback, like that's actually going to take a lot of time, right? You're going to send like people a request, like I don't know, like 90% of them might not even respond, and then 10% of them might respond, and then like you sort of like by the time you schedule everything, it's quite difficult. And in the at least like in the last 2 years in the pandemic era, when you had to do these things on Zoom, it would become like incredibly hard, where you can't get like users into a single room and sort of like do this kind of like more free flowing discussion. So all this adds up, right? I mean, it'll take you like 3 or 4 weeks just to like get all that user feedback in. So you have to like also balance between the effort versus the insights that you want, and that's the other angle that we usually evaluate as well.
Yeah. So interesting, Gaurav. I'll just maybe just connect that, add on to that, right? Maybe I come from a hardware space, so for us, the design of experiment is something that's quite intuitive and native for me. I like what Scott mentioned in his talk earlier on about being very clear about the whole hypothesis of what is this thing that you really want to do. I personally find that to be very helpful. That a lot of times people tend to miss out. If we are very clear about that, and when we are we clarify very properly at the beginning, what are the questions or what is the thing that we really want to find out, and be very concise and sharp about it. I think that is something that is important, that is useful. That we have to be very clear about that part of the question. That usually I find it personally very helpful to keep the team from deviating too far or from digressing.
Yeah, I want to chime in on this question as well, which I think all of you guys brought up good points, and it got me thinking. How we say that experiments start with a hypothesis, but how do hypotheses start and come about? And I think that's where the user research and the design thinking can come in, because that's where, when we talk to users, when we talk to our customers, that's where we generate what ideas and hypotheses that we want to test in the first place. And that becomes especially relevant if you move higher up the stack in terms of the experimentation spectrum, when you're testing what is the right problem that you're trying to solve, or what is the solution that can best solve the problem. It helps to complement experimentation with some kind of design thinking or user research, so that like you guys mentioned, you can understand the why behind the user behaviors that you're observing.
Right. Okay. So, I've been scanning through the list of questions, and I think there's a one major theme that we just address. Let's address up front, which is, how do we get buy-in? How do we get buy-in for experimentation? How do we prove the benefit, especially when there are a lot of different factors, a lot of coordination, right? I think we've talked quite a bit about the complexity of any one experiment, but if we're trying to move toward being more experimental, how do you all make space, especially in the organizations that aren't already bought into the idea? Any wisdom? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, maybe I can just start off a little bit. In my previous organization, it didn't always started off easily in terms of experimentation as how it is right now for me in GovTech, right? What I thought was very helpful was to really explain to my board and to my stakeholders, senior stakeholders, that this whole thing about experimentation actually is about eliminating waste, right? About really bringing the uncertainty up front and dealing with it. I think when you talk to people who are more on the business side, they will probably find this a lot easier to understand, right? Rather than to go down into the weeds. And I personally find that to be very helpful, and being able to quantify what could have happened or what actually were the opportunity costs or for that matter, the type of cost that we could have avoided or waste we could have avoided. Yeah, so for me, that was something that worked very well in trying to help an organization understand the importance of experimentation.
Great. And how about, so I think cost is definitely a good one. How about time? I find that often the question will be, well, do we have the time for this experiment? Can't we just build something?
Yeah, so when I talk about cost, I include that resource, cost and opportunity cost of going the wrong way and stuff like that. So it really depends on the organization, whether they are very cost conscious in terms of money or they are very cost conscious in terms of time or lost opportunities. Yeah.
Okay. Gaurav, how about you? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think like very similar to I think what Dominic said. Basically, like one good way to think about it is like anchoring it in the opportunity cost. In fact, like quite interestingly, we were just like having this discussion just yesterday in the organization of like trying to align on this topic, right? And essentially, if you think about it, like so I normally what I normally like tell the team and like a lot of stakeholders is essentially around how can you get around to like making cheaper mistakes, right? So the cost of making a mistake, both in terms of time and money, is going to be huge, right? So normally what is expected is like if you typically think of like like how maybe a stakeholder is thinking about a particular, let's talk about a particular product launch, right? They basically are thinking that you launch something, it basically goes like ramps up like this, and basically like then there is like an accelerated curve after that, right? And I think like what ends up happening is that if this curve doesn't happen, you like you will spend like 3 months building something, and then basically you launch something, and if that curve doesn't happen, you basically not only wasted that much time, you've also not learned in that period of time, right? And like what we normally try to like get the business stakeholders. So in fact, yesterday we showed this chart to like business stakeholders where we said that you could get to this point where you think you will go linearly, or you could sort of like start with like a lot of experiments and like get to that point where in a sort of like an iterative kind of manner, where you will make like cheaper mistakes, but you will also be learning along the way. And then you'll be much more confident that from this point onwards, it can scale much faster, right? So you will end up with a lower cost. If you sort of like think of the area under the curve as cost, you will end up with a lower cost by to reach to the same point in almost the same time, right? And I think like that's where like I could see like a lot of the stakeholders sort of like started feeling, oh, actually that's interesting, because we always thought that the only way to get this is like by doing a big bang launch and like then like figuring out after that, right? So you actually have to like get them to understand like in terms of like I think both the opportunity cost in terms of money and in terms of like times, right? So we normally find that kind of like discussion quite helpful. And then of course there are like broader kind of like initiatives that we do, like what I talked about earlier is like the empower team kind of concept, that where we've tried to like cascade, saying that like if we want to move towards broader outcomes instead of outputs, we have to like start talking about empowered teams. So the team need to have flexibility to create that kind of output. And for that, like business stakeholders should be a part of those empowered teams, right? So that we are not sort of like doing something in isolation in product and engineering. We are also sort of like bringing the business stakeholders along in terms of like this hypothesis creation and testing, right? So those are at least like a couple of ways that we found it useful to get that alignment.
Great, that's helpful. It reminds me of a story. I started a new role as a leader at one point, and the very first thing I tried to do was introduce an experiment. And we found at the end of the experiment that the thing that we wanted to build just wasn't going to work. Like it wasn't even that it wasn't going to work, but nobody was even going to use it. And so we canceled the whole project. And I actually felt worried. What have I just done? I've just canceled the whole project. Are they going to hate me? Right. And it turned out that was a good thing, because it meant, and thankfully I was able to get my leaders to understand that, right? It was a good thing that we canceled the whole project, because we effectively redirected that effort and that team's time to do something else. So we were able to find out in advance that we weren't wasting time. I don't know, I think that goes to Dominic, your point as well, right? If we can frame it in opportunity cost, we don't always have that clear of an example, right? To be able to say, look, this would have been a waste of time. But if there are things that we can do to try to anchor that information and frame it that way, rather than slowing people down from getting started from work, which is sometimes the impression that they have, I think that's really helpful.
Yep. I just wanted to add, in terms of how do we lower the opportunity cost, it might be also helpful to build the infrastructure of experimentation. Like if you see, for example, the big tech companies, they do millions of thousands or hundreds of thousands of experiments within a year. How are they able to do that? They can do that with virtually like almost zero opportunity cost, because there's that infrastructure that's already in place. So they can do that a lot more easily. In terms of how do you get started, I want to go back to the example I shared earlier about small wins. So you can, in a big organization, it's very hard to convince the stakeholders. But if you can start, for example, with even like A/B testing emails, landing pages, prove that there's value there, it moves the metrics, then you could slowly move up and convince the stakeholders. And eventually, if you invest in that infrastructure, then you can build up towards a whole experimentation culture and transformation and shift for your organization.
So there's a question in our at the top of our list of questions from small, medium enterprises. And I don't know if any of us on this panel have experience with that, but maybe we can offer some wisdom, because I think I agree with you, right? Having the culture built in, having the infrastructure built up, all that is wonderful. But if you're just trying to get started and you're small, what's your advice? What's your advice on how to get going from an experimental point of view without the infrastructure? Sylvia, I think you mentioned, maybe you can start from that with you.
Yeah. So how I would do it, and actually definitely there's some elements there also from how we kick-started it at Zalora, is like I would look for the right people on the team, right? Not everyone has, especially in this context, like small, medium enterprises, not everyone has the budget to go and hire a complete growth and experimentation team. But maybe there are already team members who are showing some interest in the topic, who have brought it up, who bring up ideas like how about we speak to some customers, like can I run an A/B test or something like that. And I think for the leaders in the audience, I would recommend to look out for those signs, because those are exactly the people actually you want on board. And it doesn't matter what title they have or in which department they're working at the moment. I think this culture and this way of thinking is essentially how you get started. So people who are curious, who like to come up with new ideas or formulating hypotheses, Ideally, there should be also someone on the team with a very analytical mindset to sort of like keep everyone in shape, and to focus on the data and analyze it in a very objective way. And on the more technical side, if I think about different types of engineers and different personalities, I think there are those who like to work on a topic, a feature, or a piece of code over a longer period of time, and they like to perfection it. But then you also have the type of engineer who likes to do it in a bit more hacky way and fast and pragmatic. And I think those are very helpful engineers to have also on the team to sort of work on the first couple experiments. Can be controversial because they're going to break things and maybe the rest of the team will hate them for it. But actually, I would say that if that happens, you're somewhat on the right track of like creating like a subculture within the organization that has the right mindset and enough motivation also, to continue with these experiments. And that's how it all starts from there. Yeah.
Great.
Yep.
Thanks, Amy.
I wanted to add on this SME example as well. So I advised some SMEs in the past, and I think what's really helpful is to distinguish whether you're a B2C or a B2B type of SME. If you're more of a B2B type, it's probably not as, I would say this is where it helps to think when not to do experimentation. If you're B2B, it's probably like you already get direct feedback from your clients most of the time. So maybe experimentation will just provide a very incremental benefit to your business. If you're a B2C SME, it might be helpful, for example, to run like Facebook ads to start with. That can be a very simple step. Facebook ads or Instagram ads, they provide very good tools to do like A/B tests, just to test your message, testing your visuals. And that can be a start for validating and helping you understand what is my value proposition to my customers, just with those simple examples. And then you can also use tools like Optimizely, for example. That's like a free or very low cost tool for you to help test your landing page. So if you're an SME with a landing page, you can just sign up for that and then test different messages on your landing page itself as well. And try out different versions, connect that to the Facebook ads, for example. And that can be a very practical way for you to start with experimentation.
Great. Any other tips on how to get started? If not, we can move on. So it's interesting that there's definitely some questions here around MVP and RAT and how to define the difference between that first test feature and making it into a product. How do you make that decision? How do you decide that this is the thing we're going to test, and then once we prove it, how does it become a product? So this is that second step, like that second phase of Scott's hierarchy. I'll just throw it out there. One of the panelists have any point of view on how you make that decision?
I think that the two keywords for me is always minimum and riskiest. Yeah. There's no right or wrong in my opinion. And if you think broader in the whole entire product lifecycle management, right? Experimentation actually don't really stop. And this minimum thing is always circling back over and over again, because each stage as you kind of like build up a product, there is always this next minimum thing that you need to do. So in my mind, I think so long as actually you are able to gather enough user, you have built up something that is enough to proceed to the next step, right? Then you should just take the lead. So I don't really kind of like draw a very clear line. I keep to that two principle of minimum and most riskiest, and really, that is something that in the whole life cycle management is continuous in nature.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, everything we do, even in the old days of tech development, it was an experiment, right? We spent time, we built the thing, we put it out there. It either worked or it didn't. So effectively what we're saying is how do we do that in smaller ways so that we can learn more quickly and spend less time on the things that don't work? Okay. All right, we've got about 5 more minutes. And I think from the questions, there's definitely one question here about, I think, reacting to this idea of doing many experiments at once. How do we balance the best, how do we coordinate between different experiments and make sure that the thing that we're testing, the outcome that we get is based on that one specific thing that we're testing? Right, how do you coordinate this culture of multiple experiments and the logistics around it? Gaurav, you probably have a lot of experience on this.
Yeah, so I think like as part of like a lot of the domains that I've like led in the past, like some of them, for example, like touch, like if, for example, if you touch like the homepage of an app, like basically it's basically like a breeding ground of experiments, right? Because like every possible sort of like vertical like touches on that particular real estate, right? So you have to be able to isolate the impact of each of the experiments that you're running. So it becomes very important to sort of like define the experimentation framework in such a way that when a product manager or the analyst is sort of like setting up the experiment, they're able to like figure out a unique group of like users that only, or a cohort of users that will only be subject to that particular condition, right? And that condition might not necessarily be only that experiment. It might be a combination of like two experiments that are running in parallel. But unless you have like that kind of like experimentation framework where you can like run these kind of parallel experiments, you often come up with results where you cannot isolate the impact, right? I think like to what Amy is talking about, if you're trying to run like a lot of experiments, right? But I think like it also one of the maybe like the counterpoints to that is like also that sometimes it actually doesn't make sense to like run experiments for everything, right? So we like I think there are like examples, like if you're trying to like think about the efficiency of a supply chain, I think like Amy might connect to some of the examples at Redmart. Like if you basically know that at some step in the warehouse there is an inefficiency, and you basically are trying to like solve for that particular inefficiency, you don't need to like run an experiment for it. Like you already know what that inefficiency is because the person is taking 3 steps to do it, and you like cut it down to 2 steps. So as long as you like understand from the users there that they are okay doing it in 2 steps, you should just go ahead and do it, right? There are other examples where you should ideally not do experimentation, like for example, pricing, right? Like you can't show different prices. I know like basically this is a controversial topic, but there are companies that still go ahead and do it, right? But the challenge is like, again, like one of the examples from Redmart where we were trying to smoothen out the demand during the day in order to optimize our fleet by trying to introduce surge pricing in certain slots because we had like fewer trucks available at that point in time. You can't show like different prices to different users at that point in time because then that could like have a real like public backlash, right? And it's also unfair to users because you're trying to actually smoothen it out at an aggregate level, not at a local optimal level, right? So there are also these kind of examples where ideally teams get into sort of like trying to run an experiment for everything, and sometimes it's not needed, right? So also need to like maybe like do the minimum number of experiments that are needed to like validate the minimum hypothesis, and sort of like move quickly from there, right? So the eventual intention should be higher velocity to impact, right? And that's what the team should be trying to get to, not just like experiments for the sake of running experiments as well.
Yes, absolutely. Well said. All right, we're at 12:29. Does anybody have any last wisdom? One nugget of wisdom that you want to share on how to cultivate a culture of experimentation in your organization? You want to be the last?
Yes, yeah, I guess it's really to embrace failure, right? Make sure that people don't be afraid to make it wrong, right? Important thing is to really learn from it. Yeah, so that's something that I strongly believe in.
All right. Okay. Well, on that note, I think so let's take that failure that we're embracing and turn it around to the positive of opportunity cost, right? We're saving time, we're decreasing waste, and we're embracing that. Right. Absolutely. Okay. All right. It is 12:30. Thank you all. I think this has been a really interesting conversation. It's the beginning of a longer conversation, to be honest, because there are many wonderful topics and questions that we could be asking. We didn't make it through all of the questions, but I think there's a really good set of points covered today. So thank you for your time. Also, thank you, Scott, for your work. You're actually the mastermind behind this initiative. So thank you for organizing it and for presenting. And special thanks to the team behind the scenes who is helping us at NUS ISS today. And finally, thanks to all of our audience. Really appreciate your participation. And please do fill out a survey that we'll be sending out so that you can help us improve on our events and also improve on our content. If you're interested in any of our courses, take a look at our website. And we look forward to hearing from you again. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.